The sound of 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roaring to life in my driveway at dawn wasn't something I'd ever expected to hear in Millbrook Springs. But then again, nothing about the last 48 hours had been expected. When that EF4 tornado touched down 2 nights ago, I thought I was going to die alone in my farmhouse cellar. Instead, I found myself sheltering 12 leather-clad strangers who would change my life forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Wells, though most folks around here just call me Cat. At 57, I've lived in this same farmhouse for 32 years, ever since my late husband David and I bought it as newlyweds fresh out of college. The white clapboard house sits on 40 acres of rolling farmland about 15 miles outside Millbrook Springs, Oklahoma, far enough from town that you can see every star in the night sky, but close enough that the grocery store delivery truck doesn't charge extra. The morning of April 15th started like any other Tuesday. I was in my kitchen making coffee when the weather alert came through on my phone. Severe thunderstorm warning, possible tornado activity, seek immediate shelter. Living in Tornado Alley, you get used to these warnings. Most of the time they amount to nothing more than some heavy rain and impressive lightning. I'd been through dozens of them over the years. But something felt different that morning. The air had that peculiar stillness that old-timers say comes before the really bad storms. The birds had gone quiet hours earlier, and my German shepherd, Rusty, had been pacing restlessly since sunrise, whining at doors and windows like he was trying to tell me something important. I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the western sky turn an ominous shade of green, when I heard the first rumble of thunder in the distance. That's when I noticed them on the horizon. A line of motorcycles, maybe 12 or 13 bikes, moving fast along County Road 47 that runs past my property. Even from a distance, I could tell they were Harleys by the distinctive sound of their engines. The sight struck me as odd. Most motorcycle clubs I'd encountered over the years were weekend warriors who stuck to fair weather riding. These riders were heading straight into what looked like the storm of the century. Either they were incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. 20 minutes later, the tornado sirens started wailing from town. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be just another thunderstorm. The sky had turned an angry black-green color I'd only seen once before, back in '99 when an F3 tornado had leveled half of neighboring Clearwater County. I grabbed my emergency radio, a flashlight, and my photo albums, and headed for the storm cellar David had insisted on building when we first moved to the farm. The cellar was a concrete bunker built into the hillside behind the house, equipped with a reinforced steel door that could withstand winds up to 200 miles per hour. David had been obsessive about tornado preparedness, having grown up in Moore, Oklahoma, where he'd lived through the devastating 1999 outbreak as a teenager. He'd designed the cellar himself, making it large enough to shelter not just our family, but any neighbors who might need refuge. I'd barely made it inside and secured the door when the wind started picking up in earnest. Through the small ventilation grate, I could hear debris hitting the hillside above me. Tree branches, roof shingles, and what sounded like pieces of farm equipment were being hurled around by winds that must have been approaching 100 miles per hour. That's when I heard the motorcycles again, much closer this time. The engines were racing, and I could hear shouting over the howling wind. I pressed my face to the ventilation grate and saw the most incredible sight. The same group of bikers I'd spotted earlier was racing across my property, their bikes struggling against the fierce crosswinds. They were heading straight for my farmhouse, but they weren't going to make it in time. The tornado was bearing down on us like a freight train, and these people were about to be caught in the open with nowhere to shelter. Without thinking, I threw open the cellar door and started screaming at them over the wind. "Here, over here, there's a shelter." The lead rider, a tall figure in black leather, spotted me immediately and started gesturing to the others. Within seconds, all 12 motorcycles were roaring toward the hillside. The riders didn't even bother to properly park their bikes. They just abandoned them in the grass and came running toward the cellar as chunks of debris the size of refrigerators started falling from the sky. I held the door open as they piled inside, counting heads as they passed. 12 riders, just as I'd thought. Men and women, all wearing the same black leather jackets with a patch I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The last person through the door was a woman about my age with steel gray hair and the most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen. "Thank you," she said breathlessly as I slammed the door shut behind her. "We owe you our lives." Before I could respond, the tornado hit with the force of a runaway train. The concrete walls of the cellar shook, and the sound was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the howling wind you hear in movies, it was more like standing inside a jet engine while someone drove a freight train over your head. The air pressure changed so dramatically that my ears popped repeatedly, and I could feel the suction trying to pull the reinforced door right off its hinges. For 27 minutes, we huddled together in that cellar while the tornado passed over us. None of us spoke, there was no point in trying to talk over the noise. Instead, we just waited it out, 13 strangers pressed together in a space meant for maybe 8 people listening to my entire world being rearranged above our heads. When the noise finally stopped and the air pressure returned to normal, the silence was almost as overwhelming as the chaos had been. I cautiously opened the cellar door and stepped outside to survey the damage. What I saw took my breath away. My farmhouse was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, but completely gone. The only thing left was the concrete foundation and a few scattered pieces of timber that had somehow managed to stay put. My barn was gone too, along with the chicken coop, the old grain silo, and the workshop where David used to restore antique tractors. 40 acres of farmland had been scraped clean, leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. But somehow, miraculously, the 12 motorcycles were still there. They'd been moved around quite a bit, and a couple of them were lying on their sides, but they all appeared to be intact. It was as if the tornado had deliberately avoided them while destroying everything else in its path. The woman with the gray hair emerged from the cellar behind me and let out a low whistle as she surveyed the destruction. "Sweet mother of pearl," she said. "That was a big one." "Everything's gone," I said numbly, still trying to process what I was seeing. 32 years of my life, and it's all just gone. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you're alive, and that's what matters most. Houses can be rebuilt, lives can't be replaced." One by one, the other riders emerged from the cellar. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from what looked like early 30s to mid-60s. About half were men and half were women, and they all carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who'd seen their share of trouble. But what struck me most was how respectful they were. They didn't touch anything without asking, they helped each other check for injuries, and they spoke in the low, measured tones of people who understood the gravity of the situation. The gray-haired woman seemed to be their leader. She introduced herself as Delilah Cross, and the others clearly deferred to her judgment. One by one, she introduced me to the rest of the group. There was Tommy, a bear of a man with a gray beard who looked like he could bench press a motorcycle. Maria, a petite Latina woman with intricate tattoos covering both arms. Jake and Jesse, twin brothers from Texas who finished each other's sentences. Luna, a young woman with purple hair and multiple piercings who couldn't have been more than 35. And 6 others whose names blurred together in my shock-addled brain. "We need to get you to town," Delilah said, studying my face with those piercing blue eyes. "You're in shock, and you need medical attention. Plus you'll need to contact your insurance company and start making arrangements." I nodded absently, still staring at the empty foundation where my house had stood just an hour earlier. The photo albums I'd saved were clutched against my chest, and I realized they might be the only physical memories I had left of my life with David. "The roads are probably blocked," I said. "That tornado was huge. There's going to be debris everywhere." Tommy, the big man with the beard, spoke up for the first time. "Don't worry about that, we've got experience getting through rough terrain. We'll get you where you need to go." It turned out that was an understatement. These weren't just weekend motorcycle enthusiasts. They moved with the precision of a military unit, quickly assessing the situation and formulating a plan. Within 30 minutes, they had their bikes upright and running. 2 of the motorcycles had minor damage, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with some creative field repairs using tools they carried in their saddlebags. Delilah insisted that I ride with her rather than trying to navigate the debris-filled roads in my truck, assuming my truck had even survived the tornado. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look at the devastation that had been my home. The old oak tree, where David and I had been married, was split right down the middle, its massive trunk twisted into an impossible shape. The garden where I'd spent countless hours tending vegetables and flowers was buried under 3 feet of mud and debris from someone else's property. But as I climbed onto the back of Delilah's Harley, I felt something unexpected. Along with the grief and shock, there was a tiny spark of something that might have been relief. For the first time in 5 years, since David's death from cancer, I had no choice but to move forward. The life I'd been clinging to was literally gone with the wind, and maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The ride to town was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Delilah navigated the debris-strewn roads with the skill of someone who'd done this before, weaving between fallen trees and chunks of buildings while the other 11 riders formed a protective convoy around us. They communicated through hand signals and brief radio transmissions, moving like a choreographed dance team. What should have been a 45-minute drive took nearly 2 hours, but we made it to Millbrook Springs without incident. The town had been hit hard by the tornado's outer edge, but most of the buildings were still standing. The Emergency Operations Center had been set up in the high school gymnasium, and it was chaos. Displaced families, emergency workers, insurance adjusters, and volunteers were all trying to coordinate relief efforts while dealing with spotty cell phone service and limited resources. Delilah helped me through the initial paperwork and made sure I was seen by one of the volunteer nurses who was checking tornado victims for injuries. Physically, I was fine aside from some minor bruises and scratches. Emotionally, I was operating on autopilot, going through the motions while my brain tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. The Red Cross had set up a temporary shelter in the elementary school cafeteria, and that's where I spent my first night as a tornado refugee. The bikers had disappeared sometime during the afternoon, and I assumed they'd moved on to wherever they'd been heading when the storm hit. I didn't expect to see them again. But I was wrong. The next morning, I was awakened by the distinctive sound of Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulling into the school parking lot. I looked out the cafeteria window and saw all 12 of them, plus what appeared to be several additional bikes with riders I didn't recognize. They were setting up some kind of camp in the parking lot, complete with portable tables, grills, and enough supplies to feed an army. Delilah found me in the cafeteria and invited me outside to join them for breakfast. What I discovered left me speechless. These weren't just random bikers who'd gotten caught in a storm. They were members of something called the Guardian Angels Motorcycle Club, and they specialized in disaster relief. "We've been doing this for over 20 years, Delilah explained as she handed me a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon cooked on a portable propane grill. Started after Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida. A group of us were down there helping with cleanup, and we realized that motorcycles could get into areas where trucks and cars couldn't go. We could deliver supplies to people who were cut off from traditional relief efforts." She gestured toward the other riders, who were busy organizing supplies and coordinating with local emergency management officials. "We've got members all over the country. When word goes out that there's been a major disaster, whoever can get there does. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 of us, sometimes it's 50. I watched in amazement as the bikers worked with quiet efficiency. They weren't there for publicity or recognition. Most of them had taken time off from their regular jobs and paid their own expenses to travel hundreds of miles just to help strangers. Luna, the young woman with purple hair, turned out to be a licensed contractor who was already assessing structural damage and helping families determine what could be salvaged from their homes. Jake and Jesse were electricians who were working with the power company to restore electricity to the hardest-hit areas. "Why?" I asked Delilah. "Why do you do this?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the devastation that stretched beyond the town limits. "Everyone has their reasons," she said finally. "For most of us, it's because we've been where these people are now. We know what it's like to lose everything and feel like the world has forgotten about you." Something in her tone made me study her face more carefully. There was a depth of sadness in those blue eyes that spoke of personal experience with loss and trauma. But there was also a strength that I envied, a sense of purpose that I'd been missing from my own life for years. "What about you?" I asked. "What's your reason?" Delilah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's a long story. Maybe I'll tell you sometime when we're not in the middle of a disaster zone." Over the next 3 days, I watched the guardian angels work miracles. They coordinated with FEMA and the Red Cross, but they also filled gaps that the larger organizations couldn't address. When an elderly man needed medication that wasn't available at the emergency shelter, Maria rode her bike 60 miles to the nearest functioning pharmacy and brought it back. When a family with young children was staying in their car because they were afraid of crowded shelters, Tommy and another rider spent an entire day clearing debris from the family's property so they could stay in their damaged but habitable home. And they kept an eye on me, even though I insisted I didn't need special attention. Delilah checked on me several times a day, making sure I was eating and sleeping, and dealing with the mountain of paperwork that comes with losing everything in a natural disaster. When I broke down crying during a particularly frustrating phone call with my insurance company, Luna sat with me for 2 hours, not saying much but somehow making me feel less alone. On the 4th day, most of the other guardian angels started preparing to leave. They'd done what they came to do, and other disasters in other places were demanding their attention. But Delilah lingered, and I found myself hoping she wouldn't leave just yet. In the space of a few days, she'd become something I hadn't had since David died. A friend who understood loss without trying to fix it. "I need to ask you something," she said, as we sat on the steps of the elementary school, watching the sun set over a landscape that was slowly beginning to show signs of recovery. "And I want you to think carefully before you answer." I nodded, curious about what had put such a serious expression on her face. "You said you'd lived in that farmhouse for 32 years. That's a long time, a lot of memories tied up in that place. But now it's gone, and you have a choice to make. You can rebuild on the same spot, try to recreate what you had before. Or you can start fresh somewhere else, build something completely new." The question hit me harder than I'd expected. For the past 4 days, I'd been operating under the assumption that I would rebuild. It's what David would have wanted, I'd told myself. It's what made sense financially. It's what normal people did after disasters. But sitting there with Delilah, watching the first stars appear in a sky that looked different somehow, I realized I wasn't sure that's what I wanted. The farmhouse had been full of memories of David, and while many of them were wonderful, they were also chains that had kept me tethered to a life that no longer existed. For 5 years, I'd been going through the motions of living while slowly disappearing into grief and isolation. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I haven't really thought about it that way." "Well, you've got time to think about it," Delilah said. "But I want you to know that if you decide you want to try something different, there might be options you haven't considered." Before I could ask what she meant, her phone rang. She answered with a simple cross here, and I listened to one side of a conversation that involved codes and coordinates and timelines that meant nothing to me. When she hung up, her expression had changed. "I have to leave tomorrow," she said. "There's been a major earthquake in California, and they need experienced teams on the ground as soon as possible." I felt a stab of disappointment that surprised me with its intensity. "Of course, I understand. But this isn't goodbye," she said firmly. "The guardian angels take care of their own, and your family now. You saved our lives, Catherine. That creates a bond that doesn't break just because we ride away." She pulled a card from her jacket pocket and handed it to me. It wasn't a business card in the traditional sense. It was more like a membership card, with the guardian angels logo and a phone number. "If you ever need anything at all, you call that number. Day or night, someone will answer."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
And if you ever decide you want to see what life looks like beyond the borders of Millbrook Springs, well, we can help with that too. I studied the card, running my fingers over the embossed logo. It was a stylized angel on a motorcycle, wings spread wide with the words Guardian Angels MC Courage Honor Service printed beneath it. "What exactly are you offering?" I asked. Delilah smiled, and this time it did reach her eyes. "A chance to be part of something bigger than yourself. A chance to turn your pain into purpose. A chance to help other people the way we helped you." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd never ridden a motorcycle in my life. I'd never traveled farther from home than Dallas, and that was for David's cancer treatments. The thought of leaving everything familiar behind and joining a group of strangers on some kind of mission to help disaster victims seemed completely insane. It also seemed like the most appealing thing anyone had suggested to me in years. "I'll think about it," I said. "Good. But don't think too long. Life's short, and there's a lot of people out there who need help. The next morning, I watched from the school parking lot as the guardian angels prepared to leave. They moved with the same efficient precision I'd observed during the tornado, but there was something bittersweet about the scene. These people had become family over the course of a few days, and now they were scattering to the four winds again. Delilah was the last to mount her bike. She walked over to where I was standing and pulled me into a fierce hug. "Remember what I said," she whispered in my ear. "The offer stands whenever you're ready." Then she was gone and I was alone again in a town that was slowly rebuilding itself from the rubble of the tornado. I spent the next week dealing with insurance adjusters and contractors, trying to figure out what came next. The insurance settlement would be enough to rebuild the farmhouse, but not much more. I could recreate the life I'd had before, or I could take the money and start over somewhere else. It was during a particularly frustrating phone call with a contractor who wanted to charge me twice the normal rate because of high demand for construction services that I made my decision. I hung up the phone, walked out to my rental car, and drove to the empty lot where my farmhouse had stood. The tornado had been remarkably thorough. There was nothing left but the concrete foundation and a few scattered pieces of debris. The insurance company had already arranged for the major cleanup, so even most of the fallen trees had been hauled away. It looked like a blank slate waiting for someone to write a new story on it. But as I stood there in the middle of what had been my living room, I realized the story I wanted to write wasn't going to happen on this particular piece of land. David was buried in the cemetery in town, and I would always love him and cherish our memories. But he was gone and I was still alive, and maybe it was time to start acting like it. I pulled out the card Delilah had given me and dialed the number. A woman's voice answered on the second ring. "Guardian Angels Dispatch. This is Rachel." "Hi," I said, suddenly feeling foolish. "My name is Catherine Wells. I was given this number by Delilah Cross, and she said I should call if I ever needed anything." "Catherine Wells," Rachel repeated, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "From the Oklahoma tornado. Delilah told us about you. What can we do for you, honey?" "I think," I said, looking out at the empty horizon where my old life used to be. "I think I want to learn how to ride a motorcycle." 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in the parking lot of Maddox Motorcycle Training Center in Tulsa, staring at a row of gleaming Harleys and wondering what the hell I was doing. The phone call with Rachel had led to a series of conversations with various Guardian Angels members, all of whom seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of me joining their ranks. But excitement and capability were two different things, and I wasn't sure I possessed the latter. "You must be Catherine," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, wearing jeans, boots, and a Guardian Angels t-shirt. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent years on the road, but his smile was warm and genuine. "I'm Rick Maddox. Delilah called and told me you might be stopping by." Rick owned the training center and it turned out had been one of the founding members of the Guardian Angels back in 1992. His facility was specifically designed for teaching people how to ride motorcycles safely, with a special focus on the kind of riding that disaster relief work required. "I have to be honest," I said, shaking his offered hand. "I've never even sat on a motorcycle before. I'm not sure I'm cut out for this." Rick chuckled. "You'd be surprised how many people say that on their first day. Some of our best riders started out terrified of motorcycles. Fear can be healthy if you channel it into respect for the machine and the road." He led me inside the training center, which was part classroom and part garage. The walls were covered with maps, safety posters, and photographs of Guardian Angels members in action at various disaster sites. Hurricane Katrina, the Joplin tornado, Superstorm Sandy, the California wildfires. Dozens of disasters I remembered seeing on the news, and apparently the Guardian Angels had been there for all of them. "Coffee?" Rick asked, gesturing toward a pot that looked like it had been brewing since sometime in the Clinton administration. "Sure," I said, though I wasn't sure my nerves could handle caffeine at the moment. As he poured 2 cups, Rick began explaining the Guardian Angels training program. It wasn't just about learning to ride a motorcycle. They also taught emergency medical response, disaster psychology, radio communications, and something called community integration protocols. which apparently meant knowing how to work with local authorities and other relief organizations without stepping on toes. The thing about disaster relief, Rick said, settling into a chair across from me, is that it's not just about showing up with supplies and good intentions. You have to understand the politics, the personalities, the cultural dynamics of the communities you're trying to help. Sometimes the biggest disaster isn't the hurricane or tornado, it's the breakdown of social structures that happens afterward. I thought about my own experience in Millbrook Springs, how the Emergency Operations Center had been chaos partly because nobody seemed to know who was in charge of what. The guardian angels had moved through that chaos like they understood its underlying currents, working with officials instead of around them. How long does the training take? I asked. Depends on the person. The motorcycle training is usually about 2 weeks for someone starting from scratch. The emergency response certification takes another month. But here's the thing, Catherine. We don't just throw new people into the deep end. Your first few deployments would be with experienced teams, and you'd be handling support roles while you learn the ropes. He pulled out a thick binder and set it in front of me. This is our current deployment schedule. We've got teams heading to Louisiana next week for flood relief, another group going to Montana for wildfire suppression support, and a smaller team working on long-term recovery in Puerto Rico. I flipped through the binder, amazed by the scope of their operations. These weren't just weekend warriors playing at being heroes. This was a sophisticated organization with protocols, training standards, and a track record of effective disaster response going back decades. What's the time commitment? I asked. I mean, if I do this, how much of my life would it take up? Rick leaned back in his chair, studying my face. That depends on how much of your life you want it to take up. Some members only deploy a few times a year, usually to disasters close to home. Others, like Delilah, are on the road more often than they're home. It's really about what you're looking for. What was I looking for? The question had been gnawing at me for weeks. I had enough insurance money to rebuild my farmhouse and settle back into the quiet life I'd been living since David's death. I could volunteer at the local library, tend a garden, maybe take up quilting like my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson kept suggesting. It would be a pleasant, peaceful existence. It would also be empty. I think I said slowly, I'm looking for a reason to get up in the morning. Something that matters. Rick nodded like he'd heard those words before. Yeah, that's what most of us are looking for. The disaster relief work, it gives you perspective. Hard to feel sorry for yourself when you're helping people who've lost everything rebuild their lives. He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the training course. But I'm going to give you some advice, and I want you to really hear it. Don't do this because you're running away from grief. Grief follows you wherever you go. Do it because you're ready to transform that grief into something useful. The words hit deeper than I'd expected. Was that what I was doing? Running away from grief? Or was I finally ready to do something constructive with the pain that had been my constant companion for 5 years? Can I think about it? I asked. Of course, but while you're thinking, why don't you at least try sitting on a bike? See how it feels. 20 minutes later, I was straddling a Harley-Davidson Street 750 in the training course parking lot, my hands gripping the handlebars so tightly my knuckles were white. Rick had adjusted the bike to fit my height, and was patiently explaining the basic controls. But all I could focus on was the fact that I was sitting on several 100 pounds of machinery that could kill me if I made a mistake. Relax, Rick said, noticing my death grip on the handlebars. The bike's not even running. You're perfectly safe. Easy for him to say. He'd probably been riding since before I was born. But as I sat there, gradually relaxing my grip, and trying to absorb his instructions about clutch control and throttle response, something unexpected happened. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Anticipation, maybe. Or possibility. How does it feel? Rick asked. Terrifying, I said honestly. But also kind of exciting. That's a good sign. Fear without excitement means you're not ready. Excitement without fear means you're going to get yourself killed. We spent the next hour with me sitting on stationary motorcycles while Rick explained the basics of motorcycle operation. I didn't actually start any engines that day, but by the time I climbed back into my rental car, I knew I was going to do this. The question wasn't whether I'd join the guardian angels. The question was whether I was brave enough to become the kind of person who could handle the responsibility. That evening, I called my sister Janet in Phoenix to tell her about my decision. Janet was 3 years older than me and had always been the practical one in the family. She'd been urging me to move to Arizona ever since David died, arguing that I needed to be closer to family and farther from painful memories. "You want to do what?" she said when I explained about the motorcycle training and the guardian angels. "I want to learn to ride a motorcycle and help people who've been affected by disasters." "Catherine, you're 57 years old. You've never ridden a motorcycle in your life. And you want to go racing around the country with a bunch of bikers. That's insane." I could picture Janet sitting in her perfectly organized living room, probably making a mental list of all the reasons why my plan was ridiculous. She meant well, but she'd never understood my need for something beyond the comfortable suburban existence she'd chosen for herself. "Maybe it is insane," I said. "But insane might be exactly what I need right now. What you need is stability. Structure. You should sell that property in Oklahoma and move out here. I've already looked into some nice retirement communities. Active adult living with golf courses and social activities." The thought of spending my remaining years playing bridge and arguing about homeowners association rules made me want to scream. "Janet, I'm not ready for a retirement community. I'm not even retired. What do you call the last 5 years? You've been living like a hermit since David died." She was right, and that stung. For 5 years I'd been going through the motions of living while slowly disappearing into grief and isolation. But that was exactly why I needed to do something drastic. The people I met during the tornado, the guardian angels, they're doing something important. They're making a difference in people's lives. And what happens when you crash that motorcycle and end up in the hospital? Or worse, you're all I have left, Catherine. I can't lose you too. The conversation went downhill from there, ending with Janet hanging up after making me promise to think seriously about the risks I was taking. But as I sat in my hotel room that night, staring at the Guardian Angels membership card Delilah had given me, I realized that the biggest risk wasn't learning to ride a motorcycle. The biggest risk was spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. The next morning, I called Rick and told him I wanted to start training immediately. The first week of motorcycle training was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about learning to operate the machine. It was about overcoming decades of conditioning that told me to be careful, to avoid risks, to stay safe. Every instinct I'd developed as a farm wife and widow screamed at me to get off the motorcycle and go back to my sensible, predictable life. But Rick was a patient teacher, and he'd obviously dealt with middle-aged beginners before. He started me on the smallest, least intimidating bike in his fleet, and gradually worked me up to larger machines as my confidence grew. By the end of the first week, I was actually riding around the training course, albeit at speeds that would have been embarrassing to a 12-year-old on a bicycle. "You're thinking too much," Rick said during one particularly frustrating lesson. "Riding a motorcycle isn't just a mechanical skill. It's about trusting yourself and the machine to work together." That afternoon, something clicked. I was practicing slow-speed maneuvers in the parking lot when I stopped trying to control every aspect of the bike's movement and started flowing with it instead. Suddenly, the motorcycle didn't feel like a separate machine I was fighting. It felt like an extension of my own body. "There it is," Rick said with satisfaction as I completed a series of tight turns without putting my feet down. "That's what we've been waiting for." By the end of the second week, I was road ready. Not expert level, but competent enough to handle basic riding situations safely. Rick had me take the state motorcycle license test, which I passed on the first try, much to my own amazement. "Now comes the real education," Rick said as we stood in his office on my last day of training. "Everything you've learned so far is just the foundation. Learning to ride in disaster areas, dealing with debris and damaged roads, working as part of a team, that's a whole different skill set." He handed me a schedule of upcoming Guardian Angels deployments. Delilah suggested starting you off with the flood relief operation in Louisiana. It's not a high-intensity situation, mostly delivering supplies to isolated communities and helping with cleanup. Good place to learn the ropes without too much pressure. I studied the deployment schedule. The Louisiana team was scheduled to leave in 10 days, which would give me just enough time to get my affairs in order and purchase the gear I'd need. Rick had already helped me select a used Harley-Davidson Sportster that would be appropriate for a beginning rider, and the bike shop was preparing it with the modifications the Guardian Angels required for disaster relief work. "Are you sure about this?" Rick asked, noticing my silence. "Once you deploy with a team, you're making a commitment. These people will be depending on you." I thought about the question seriously. Was I sure? No. I was terrified, but I was also more excited than I'd been about anything in years. "I'm sure," I said. That evening, I called Delilah to let her know I'd completed the training and was planning to join the Louisiana deployment. She answered on the third ring, and I could hear wind noise in the background. "Catherine, Rick told me you aced the motorcycle training. I'm proud of you. Where are you?" I asked, noting the background noise. "Heading back from California. The earthquake response is winding down, so I'm finally heading home to Denver. How do you feel about everything?" "Scared," I said honestly. "But ready." "Good. Scared and ready is the perfect combination for this work. I'll be leading the Louisiana deployment, so you'll have a familiar face on your first mission." The word mission sent a thrill through me. At 57, I was about to embark on my first mission as a guardian angel. It sounded like something from an action movie, not the life of a middle-aged widow from Oklahoma. "Delilah," I said, "can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "The other day, when I asked why you do this work, you said it was a long story. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share that story sometime." There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of wind and engine noise. When Delilah spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than I'd heard it before. "Yeah," she said. "I think it's time I told someone. We'll have plenty of time to talk during the Louisiana deployment." After we hung up, I spent the evening making lists of everything I needed to do before leaving for Louisiana. Sell the property in Oklahoma, or at least arrange for someone to manage it while I was gone. Close out David's remaining accounts. Update my will and insurance policies. Figure out what to do with 32 years' worth of possessions that had been scattered to various storage facilities and relatives' garages. But as I worked through the practical details, I realized I was also preparing for something much bigger than a 2-week deployment to Louisiana. I was preparing to completely reinvent my life at an age when most people were starting to think about slowing down. The next morning, I drove out to the empty lot where my farmhouse had stood, wanting to see it one more time before making my final decision about the property. A construction crew was already at work on the neighboring farm, rebuilding a barn that had been damaged in the same tornado that destroyed my house. Life was moving forward, with or without me. I stood on the concrete foundation and tried to imagine rebuilding the farmhouse exactly as it had been. Same floor plan, same cozy kitchen where David and I had shared thousands of meals, same bedroom where we'd planned our future and where I'd held his hand as cancer slowly stole him away from me. The insurance money would cover it, and I could be back to my old life within 6 months. But as I stood there, I realized that my old life was gone just as completely as the house itself. The woman who had lived in that farmhouse for 32 years had died along with David, slowly fading away until all that was left was a ghost going through the motions of living. The tornado hadn't destroyed my life. It had revealed that I'd been living in ruins for years already. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a familiar voice. "Catherine, this is Maria, from the Guardian Angels. We met during the tornado response." "Of course I remember you. How are you?" "I'm good, thanks. Listen, I heard from Delilah that you're planning to join the Louisiana deployment. I wanted to call and welcome you to the family officially." The word family hit me harder than I'd expected. In the 3 weeks since the tornado, I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of motorcycle training and disaster relief work that I hadn't fully processed the social dimension of what I was joining. "I also wanted to give you a heads up about something," Maria continued. Delilah's planning to share her story with you during the Louisiana deployment, and I think you should know what you're in for. It's not an easy story to hear. Can you tell me what it's about? That's not my story to tell. But I will say this. Every member of the Guardian Angels has a reason for being here, and most of those reasons involve loss. Delilah's reason is bigger than most. After Maria hung up, I found myself even more curious about Delilah's background. What kind of loss could drive someone to spend 20 years riding across the country helping strangers? And why was she finally ready to share that story now? I spent the next week tying up loose ends in Oklahoma. The property went to a local real estate agent who specialized in rural land, with instructions to either find a buyer or a long-term tenant who could maintain the acreage. Most of David's remaining possessions went to charity, keeping only a few photographs and mementos that I could carry with me. The hardest part was visiting David's grave to explain what I was doing. I'd been going to the cemetery every week for 5 years, usually just sitting by his headstone and telling him about my day. It had become such a routine that I wasn't sure how to break it. "I'm leaving, David," I said, kneeling next to the granite marker that bore his name and dates. "I don't know for how long, but I'm finally ready to start living again instead of just existing." I waited for some sign, some indication of what he would think about my decision. David had always been the cautious one in our relationship, the voice of reason who talked me out of impulsive decisions. But he'd also been supportive of my dreams, even when they scared him. "I think you'd be proud of me," I said finally. Terrified, but proud. The morning of the Louisiana deployment, I loaded my new Harley-Davidson Sportster into the back of a truck and drove to the Guardian Angels staging area in Little Rock, Arkansas. The staging area was a privately owned truck stop that had been converted into a sort of base camp for disaster relief operations. There were dormitory-style sleeping quarters, a commercial kitchen, and a massive garage where motorcycles could be serviced and repaired. When I arrived, I found myself in the middle of controlled chaos. Dozens of Guardian Angels members were preparing for various deployments, loading supplies, checking equipment, and conducting final briefings. The organization was much larger than I'd realized, with members ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, representing every conceivable background and profession. "Catherine," Delilah's voice cut through the noise, and I turned to see her approaching with a clipboard in one hand and a radio in the other. She looked every inch the field commander, confident and focused in a way that made me suddenly aware of how much I still had to learn. "Ready for your first real deployment?" she asked, giving me a quick hug. "As ready as someone can be when they have no idea what they're getting into," I said. Delilah laughed. "Honest answer. I like that. Come on, let me introduce you to the rest of the Louisiana team." The Louisiana deployment team consisted of 8 Guardian Angels members, including myself. There was Tommy, the big man with the beard, whom I remembered from the tornado. Luna, the young woman with purple hair, who turned out to be our logistics coordinator. A married couple named Frank and Sarah, who specialized in medical response, and 3 others whose expertise ranged from communications to construction to social services. Our mission, Delilah explained during the briefing, is to support ongoing recovery efforts in the parishes that were hit hardest by last month's flooding. The Red Cross and FEMA have handled the immediate emergency response, but there are still isolated communities that need help with cleanup and basic services. She pointed to a map of Louisiana that was marked with various colored pins. "We'll be based in Lafayette, and working primarily in the rural areas to the west and south. Most of our work will involve delivering supplies to places that are still cut off by damaged roads, helping with debris removal, and providing transportation for people who need to get to medical appointments or government services." It sounded straightforward enough, but I'd learned during my training that disaster relief work was rarely as simple as it appeared on paper. Every community had its own unique challenges, and successful relief efforts required adapting to local conditions and building trust with people who were often suspicious of outsiders, even well-meaning ones. "Questions?" Delilah asked, looking around the room. "What's the security situation?" Frank asked. "Any issues with locals being hostile to relief workers?" "Not hostile, exactly, but some communities are dealing with tensions between different groups. Economic stress, ethnic divisions, that kind of thing." The flooding didn't create these problems, but it made them worse. We'll need to be sensitive to local dynamics and work through community leaders whenever possible. Tommy raised his hand. What about law enforcement cooperation? Mixed bag, Delilah replied. Some departments are overwhelmed and grateful for help. Others are territorial and want us to stay out of their way. We'll play it by ear and adjust our approach as needed. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from radio protocols to medical emergency procedures. By the time it was finished, I had a much clearer picture of what the next 2 weeks would involve, and I was both nervous and excited about the challenges ahead. That evening, as the team made final preparations for departure, Delilah approached me with 2 cups of coffee and gestured toward a quiet corner of the staging area. You mentioned wanting to hear my story, she said, settling into a plastic chair. Tonight seems like a good time for it. I sat down across from her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept her eyes focused on her coffee cup instead of looking at me directly. I haven't told this story to very many people, she began. Most of the guardian angels know bits and pieces, but you'll be only the 3rd person to hear the whole thing. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her gathering the courage to begin. 23 years ago, I was living in Homestead, Florida, with my husband Jack and our 2 kids. Emily was 8, and Marcus was 5. Jack was a police officer, and I was a high school math teacher. We had a nice house, good jobs, typical middle-class life. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took to maintain that steadiness. Hurricane Andrew hit on August 24, 1992. Category 5 storm, one of the most powerful hurricanes ever to make landfall in the United States. Our house was in the direct path. Delilah paused, taking a sip of coffee that I suspected was more about buying time than actual thirst. Jack was working that night, helping with emergency response. He wasn't supposed to be on duty, but they'd called in all available officers. I was home with the kids, riding out the storm in our interior hallway, like the emergency management people had told us to do. I could see where this was heading, and my heart began to break for her before she even continued. The roof came off around 3 in the morning. One minute we were huddled together, listening to the wind, and the next minute the whole house was coming apart around us. I managed to get Emily and Marcus into the bathroom, which was the most structurally sound room in the house. We stayed there for 4 hours, while the hurricane tore everything apart. Delilah's hands were shaking slightly as she set down her coffee cup. When the storm passed, I couldn't get the bathroom door open. Debris was piled against it. I could hear people outside, search and rescue teams, but it took them 6 hours to dig us out. 6 hours in that little bathroom with my kids, not knowing if Jack was alive, not knowing if help was coming. Did everyone make it out okay? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Delilah shook her head. Emily had been hit by debris when the roof came off. Internal injuries that we couldn't see. By the time the rescue teams got us to a hospital, it was too late. She died 3 days later. The words hung in the air between us, like a physical presence. I wanted to say something comforting, but what comfort could there be for a loss like that? Jack survived the hurricane, Delilah continued, but he didn't survive losing Emily. He started drinking heavily, couldn't handle being back on the police force, became violent. Marcus and I left him 2 years later, and Jack died in a car accident 6 months after that. Drunk driving. I'm so sorry, I said, the words feeling inadequate. The thing about losing a child, Delilah said, finally looking up at me, is that it changes everything about who you are. Every assumption you had about how the world works, every belief you had about justice and meaning, and the future, all of it gets torn apart. You have to choose whether to rebuild yourself, or just give up entirely. How did you rebuild? Slowly, and with help. After Jack died, Marcus and I moved to Colorado to be near my sister. I couldn't teach anymore. Couldn't handle being around other people's children when my own daughter was gone. I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small business and tried to figure out how to be a single mother while dealing with my own grief. Delilah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the motorcycles parked in neat rows under the floodlights. I started riding motorcycles about 5 years after Andrew. Needed something that felt dangerous, something that matched how I felt inside. Started with day trips, then longer rides, eventually cross-country trips, when Marcus was old enough to stay with my sister for extended periods. How did you get involved with disaster relief? Accident really. I was on a riding trip through Texas in 1998 when a tornado hit a small town called Jarrell, wiped the place off the map, killed 27 people. I happened to be at a truck stop about 10 miles away when it happened, and I spent the next week helping with search and rescue and cleanup. She turned back to face me, and I could see the passion that drove her work burning in her eyes. For the first time since Emily died, I felt useful again. I felt like there was a reason for me to keep breathing. These people had lost everything, just like I had, and I could actually help them, not just with money or supplies, but with understanding. I knew what it felt like to have your world destroyed. Is that when you started the Guardian Angels? Not right away. I kept responding to disasters individually for a few years, but I realized I was more effective when I worked with other people who understood the mission. Started recruiting other riders who had experience with disaster response, and eventually we formalized into an organization. Delilah sat back down, her expression softer now that she'd gotten through the hardest part of her story. Marcus is 28 now. He's a paramedic in Denver, married to a wonderful woman named Katie. They have 2 kids of their own, my grandchildren. He understands why I do this work, even though he worries about me being on the road so much. Do you ever regret it, choosing this life instead of something more conventional? Every day, she said without hesitation, but not because I think I made the wrong choice. I regret it because I wish Emily had lived to see the person I became, the good that came out of losing her. I think she would have been proud of what the Guardian Angels accomplish. We sat in comfortable silence, for a while both lost in our own thoughts. Finally Delilah spoke again. That's why I wanted you to join us, Catherine. Not because you lost your house in a tornado, but because I recognized something in your eyes, that first day. The same thing I saw in my own mirror for years after Emily died. You were disappearing, fading away a little more each day. This work, it doesn't cure grief, but it gives grief a purpose. What if I'm not strong enough for it? You sheltered 12 strangers during a tornado, when you could have kept that cellar door locked and saved yourself. You're stronger than you think. The next morning, we loaded our motorcycles and began the ride to Louisiana. I'd never been part of a motorcycle convoy before, and the experience was both exhilarating and intimidating. 8 bikes moving in formation down the interstate, communicating through hand signals and radio chatter, drawing stares and waves from other drivers. But as the miles passed and I grew more comfortable with the rhythm of highway riding, I began to understand something that Rick had tried to explain during my training. Riding a motorcycle wasn't just about transportation, it was about freedom, about being completely present in the moment, about trusting yourself and your machine to handle whatever the road threw at you. By the time we reached Lafayette that evening, I felt like I'd crossed more than just state lines. I'd crossed some invisible boundary between my old life and whatever was coming next. The woman who had knelt on that sidewalk in Millbrook Springs was gone, replaced by someone I was just beginning to meet. Someone who was ready to turn her grief into purpose, her pain into service, her loss into love for strangers who needed help rebuilding their own shattered worlds. The Louisiana Bayou country was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Even in early November, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of decaying vegetation mixed with diesel fuel and cooking spices. Spanish moss hung from ancient cypress trees like gray curtains, and everywhere you looked there were signs of the flooding that had devastated the region 6 weeks earlier. Watermarks on buildings showed where the floodwaters had risen 8 feet above normal levels, and mountains of debris lined the roads where cleanup crews had pulled ruined furniture and appliances from flooded homes. Our base of operations was a converted warehouse in Lafayette that had been donated by a local business owner whose own factory had been destroyed in the flooding. The Guardian Angels had transformed it into an efficient distribution center, with sleeping quarters upstairs and a garage area where our motorcycles could be serviced and supplies organized for distribution. On our first morning, Delilah gathered the team around a large map of the affected parishes that was marked with colored pins indicating various levels of recovery progress. Red pins marked communities that still had no power or clean water. Yellow pins indicated areas where basic services had been restored but significant cleanup work remained. Green pins showed communities that were mostly back to normal. The map was dominated by red and yellow pins. Our primary mission for this deployment, Delilah explained, is to support ongoing recovery efforts in the areas that are still cut off from normal supply chains. Most of these communities are accessible only by boat or by motorcycle, which is why we're here. She pointed to a cluster of red pins in Vermilion Parish, about 40 miles southwest of Lafayette. This area took the worst hit when the levee failed. Most of the roads are still impassable for regular vehicles, but our bikes can get through. There are about 200 families scattered across a dozen small communities, mostly Cajun fishing families who've been living in the bayou for generations. Tommy studied the map with the intensity of someone planning a military operation. What kind of supplies are we talking about? Medical, food, construction materials? All of the above, Delilah replied. FEMA and the Red Cross have been flying supplies in by helicopter, but it's expensive and weather dependent. We can carry smaller loads more frequently and build relationships with the local community leaders. Luna pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be an extensive database. I've been coordinating with the Parish Emergency Management Office, and they've identified several priority needs. There's a community called Bayou Badru that's been completely cut off for 3 weeks. They've got an elderly man with diabetes who's running out of insulin, and several families with young children who need baby formula and diapers. I listened to the discussion with growing anxiety. Everything they were talking about sounded incredibly important and potentially dangerous. What if I screwed up? What if someone died because I couldn't deliver critical supplies in time? Delilah must have noticed my expression because she assigned me to work with Frank and Sarah, the married couple who specialized in medical response. You'll be doing supply runs with them for the first few days, she explained. Get your feet wet with some straightforward deliveries before we throw you into the more complicated situations. Frank was a retired Army medic who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and Sarah was a nurse practitioner who'd been volunteering with disaster relief organizations for over a decade. They had the easy confidence of people who'd seen everything and weren't easily rattled by challenging conditions. The key thing to remember, Frank explained as we loaded medical supplies into waterproof saddlebags, is that we're not trying to replace the existing relief efforts. We're filling gaps and providing support for local leaders who know their communities better than we ever will. Sarah added, and we're not heroes swooping in to save the day. We're just people with motorcycles who can get to places that trucks can't reach. The real heroes are the local folks who've been taking care of each other since day one. Our first destination was a community called Petit Caillou, accessible only by a network of elevated roads that crossed miles of flooded marshland. The roads themselves were in decent condition, but they were narrow and had no guardrails, which meant that a single mistake could send you plunging into 10 feet of murky bayou water. Riding through that landscape was simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking. The flooded cypress swamps had an otherworldly quality, with submerged trees creating a forest of wooden skyscrapers rising from mirror-smooth water. But mixed in with the natural beauty were the remnants of human lives disrupted by the flood. Abandoned cars sat half-submerged in roadside ditches. Houses that had been lifted off their foundations by the flood waters sat at crazy angles, their contents scattered across acres of marsh grass. Petit Caillou turned out to be a cluster of about 15 houses built on stilts along a narrow bayou channel. Most of the houses had survived the flooding physically, but many were still without power or clean water. The community's unofficial leader was a woman named Evangeline Thibodeau, a weathered Cajun grandmother in her 70s who'd lived in the bayou her entire life. "Y'all are them motorcycle people we heard about," she said as we pulled up to her house, which served as the community's informal distribution center. "Been wonderin' when you'd make it out here." Evangeline had the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of managing family crises and community emergencies. She knew exactly which families needed what supplies, which elderly residents required medical attention, and which houses were still unsafe to occupy. She also had strong opinions about the official relief efforts. "FEMA folks, they mean well," she said as we unloaded medical supplies on her front porch. "But they don't understand how we live out here. They keep talking about relocating people to temporary housing in town, but this bayou been our home for generations. We ain't leaving just because of a little water." Sarah spent an hour examining several elderly residents who'd been without their regular medications since the flooding began. Most of the health issues were manageable, but there were a few cases that required more serious intervention than we could provide with our basic medical kit. Mrs. Baudreau needs to get to a hospital, Sarah told Evangeline quietly. Her blood pressure is dangerously high, and she's showing signs of kidney problems. If she doesn't get proper treatment soon, she could have a stroke. Evangeline nodded grimly. Been trying to convince her to go to town for weeks, but she's stubborn as a mule. Says she'd rather die in her own house than in some sterile hospital room. Frank and I spent the afternoon helping a local man named Claude repair his fishing boat, which had been damaged when the floodwaters swept it into a stand of cypress trees. Claude had been fishing these waters for 40 years and was one of the community's primary sources of fresh food, but he couldn't work with a boat that was taking on water. Working alongside Claude gave me my first real insight into the resilience and resourcefulness of the Bayou communities. These weren't people who expected someone else to solve their problems. They'd been dealing with floods, hurricanes, and economic hardship for generations, and they had an impressive capacity for improvisation and mutual support. This flood was bad, Claude acknowledged as we patched a hole in his boat's hull. But we seen worse. Hurricane Rita in 2005, that was worse. Katrina was worse. We always rebuild, always come back. This bayou, it's in our blood. But I could also see the toll that repeated disasters were taking on the community. Several of the younger families had already moved away permanently, heading for cities where they could find steady work and their children could attend schools that weren't constantly threatened by natural disasters. The people who remained were mostly older, and many of them were struggling financially even before the flood hit. The young folks, they got opportunities we never had. Evangeline explained as we sat on her porch that evening, sharing a dinner of fresh-caught catfish and homemade cornbread. Can't blame them for wanting something different. But when they leave, they take a piece of this place with them. Every family that moves away makes it harder for the ones who stay. That night, we camped on slightly higher ground near the community center, sleeping in tents we'd brought specifically for situations where local accommodations weren't available. As I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the bayou at night, I found myself thinking about the parallels between these communities and my own situation. Like me, the people of Petit Caillou were dealing with loss and trying to decide whether to rebuild their old lives or start fresh somewhere else. But unlike me, they didn't have the luxury of walking away from their responsibilities. They had elderly relatives who needed care, businesses that provided income for entire extended families, and cultural traditions that couldn't be easily transplanted to suburban neighborhoods. The next morning brought our first real crisis. Evangeline's radio crackled with an emergency call from Bayou Baburo, the isolated community that Luna had mentioned during our initial briefing. A fishing boat carrying 3 men had gone missing during the night, and the local search and rescue teams couldn't reach the area because of mechanical problems with their airboat. "We need to get out there," Delilah's voice came through our radio. "Catherine, you're with Frank and Sarah. Tommy, Luna and I will take the alternate route from the north." The ride to Bayou Baburo was treacherous even by Bayou standards. The road had been damaged by the flood and hastily repaired with gravel and wooden planks that shifted under the weight of our motorcycles. Twice we had to dismount and carry our bikes across sections where the road had been completely washed out. When we finally reached the community, we found it in chaos. About 50 people were gathered at the boat launch, everyone talking at once and pointing in different directions across the vast expanse of flooded marsh. The missing boat contained a father and his 2 teenage sons who'd gone out early that morning to check their crab traps and hadn't been seen since. The community leader, a man named Babro, who shared his name with the bayou, quickly briefed us on the situation. "Leon Habert took his boys out around 5 this morning," he explained. "Should have been back by 8 at the latest. His boat got a radio, but we ain't heard nothing since, about 6:30. Frank immediately began coordinating with the local using his military experience to organize search patterns and communication protocols. Sarah set up a triage station in case the missing men were found injured. I found myself assigned to ride back to Petit Caillou to coordinate with the official search and rescue teams and relay information between the 2 communities. The round trip took nearly 3 hours, riding hard over roads that were challenging even under the best circumstances. By the time I returned to Bayou Baburo, the afternoon sun was beginning to set and there was still no sign of the missing boat. "We found debris," Tommy reported as I arrived back at the boat launch. Pieces of fiberglass and some fishing gear about 2 miles north of here. Looks like they hit something and the boat broke apart. The mood in the community had shifted from anxious to grim. In these waters, with night approaching and the water temperature dropping, survival time was measured in hours rather than days. That's when I witnessed something that redefined my understanding of community and mutual support. Without any formal organization or direction, the entire population of Bayou Boubreau mobilized for the search effort. Men who'd been feuding over fishing territory for years worked together to coordinate search patterns. Women who'd barely spoken to each other organized food and supplies for the search teams. Elderly residents who couldn't participate physically took over childcare duties so younger adults could join the search. "This is what we do," Boubreau explained simply when I commented on the community's response. "When someone's in trouble, we all in trouble. When someone's family, we all family." The search continued throughout the night, with Guardian Angels members and local volunteers taking turns riding out to coordinate between different search teams. Around midnight, Luna picked up a faint radio signal from the northwest, and we redirected the search boats toward that area. At 2:30 in the morning, they found them. Leon Habert and his 2 sons had managed to swim to a small island after their boat hit a submerged log and started taking on water. They were cold, exhausted, and shaken, but alive. Leon had a possible concussion from hitting his head when the boat went down, and his younger son had hypothermia from the cold water, but Sarah's medical assessment showed that both would recover fully with proper treatment. The reunion scene at the boat launch was something I'll never forget. 3 generations of the Habert family embracing in the harsh glare of portable floodlights, while the entire community cheered and cried and thanked God for bringing their people home safely. It was the kind of raw, authentic emotion that you rarely see in normal circumstances, the kind of love and relief that only emerges when you face the possibility of permanent loss. But what struck me most was how quickly the celebration shifted back into action. Within minutes of the rescue boats returning, the community had organized transportation to get Leon and his son to a hospital in Lafayette, arranged for someone to look after the family's other children, and begun planning to search for and salvage what they could from the damaged boat. "We celebrate later," Evangeline said when I asked about the abrupt transition. "Right now we take care of business." The next few days fell into a routine of supply runs, medical checks, and small construction projects. I gradually became more comfortable navigating the difficult roads and waterways, and I began to understand the complex social dynamics of the bayou communities. These weren't simple rural areas where everyone knew everyone else. They were intricate networks of extended families, business relationships, cultural traditions, and historical grievances that had been evolving for generations. Every delivery we made involved more than just dropping off supplies. We had to navigate family politics, cultural sensitivities, and economic tensions that outsiders could easily stumble into without realizing it. Fortunately, Delilah and the other experienced guardian angels had learned to work through local community leaders, rather than trying to impose their own systems of organization. "The moment you start thinking you know better than the locals," Delilah warned during one of our evening briefings, "is the moment you become part of the problem instead of part of the solution." I learned this lesson firsthand during a supply run to a community called Ul Shanes, where I inadvertently stepped into the middle of a long-standing dispute between 2 branches of the same extended family. I'd been asked to deliver construction materials to help repair a damaged community center, but it turned out that the 2 family groups couldn't agree on who had the authority to accept the materials or supervise the reconstruction work. "You brought them supplies to the wrong people," one of the family elders informed me angrily. "This building belonged to our family, we've been taking care of it for 60 years. "That's not true," another elder responded just as angrily. "Your family gave up any claim to this building when y'all moved to town after Hurricane Gustav." I found myself standing in a parking lot with a motorcycle full of construction supplies, being lectured by 2 different groups of people who were all speaking rapid-fire Cajun French mixed with English, trying to understand a family dispute that apparently dated back to the 1970s. Fortunately, Frank had warned me about this exact scenario during my training. When in doubt, he'd said, "Don't choose sides, find someone everyone respects and let them sort it out." It took me 3 hours and several phone calls, but I eventually tracked down the community's retired priest, Father Boubreau, who'd been mediating family disputes in the area for over 30 years. Within 20 minutes of his arrival, the two family groups had worked out a compromise that satisfied everyone and allowed the reconstruction work to proceed. First rule of disaster relief, Father Boubreau told me with a wry smile. The disaster doesn't create the problems. It just makes the existing problems harder to ignore. By the end of our first week in Louisiana, I was beginning to understand what Delilah had meant about disaster relief work giving grief a purpose. Every day brought new challenges that required me to focus completely on the immediate task at hand. There was no time to dwell on my own losses when someone needed medical supplies delivered through a thunderstorm, or when a family needed help rebuilding their dock so they could resume their fishing business. But the work was also emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. Every community we visited was dealing with their own version of loss and recovery, and it was impossible not to be affected by the stories of families who'd lost everything and were trying to rebuild their lives from scratch. It gets easier, Sarah assured me after a particularly difficult day in a community where several families were still living in FEMA trailers because their houses had been too badly damaged to repair. Not easier emotionally, but easier to manage the emotions without letting them overwhelm you. How do you keep from burning out? I asked. By remembering that we're not responsible for fixing everything, she replied. We're just responsible for showing up and doing what we can while we're here. The communities were here before we arrived, and they'll be here after we leave. Our job is to support their recovery efforts, not to be their recovery efforts. The second week brought a new challenge when Hurricane Ida formed in the Gulf of Mexico and began tracking toward the Louisiana coast. It wasn't expected to be a major storm, but even a Category 1 hurricane could cause significant problems for communities that were still recovering from the previous flood. We need to help them prepare, Delilah announced during our evening briefing. Some of these communities are still without power or clean water. They're not ready for another storm. The next 3 days were a frantic effort to help the Bayou communities prepare for Ida's arrival. We transported emergency supplies, helped families secure their property, and assisted with evacuations for people who couldn't safely ride out another storm in their damaged homes. The work was complicated by the fact that many residents were reluctant to evacuate, having just returned to their homes after the previous disaster. They'd spent weeks cleaning up flood damage and beginning repairs, and the thought of abandoning their progress to start over again was emotionally devastating. We just got the electricity back on, one elderly woman told me as I tried to convince her to accept transportation to an emergency shelter. If we leave now, who knows when we'll be able to come back. I understood her reluctance better than she probably realized. The impulse to hold on to what you have, even when it's not safe, was something I'd been fighting for years. Sometimes the familiar disaster feels safer than the unknown alternative. But Hurricane Ida turned out to be a blessing in disguise. The storm weakened significantly before making landfall, bringing only heavy rain and moderate winds to our area. More importantly, the preparation efforts had brought together government agencies, relief organizations, and local communities in a way that improved coordination for ongoing recovery efforts. Sometimes it takes a new crisis to force people to work together, Tommy observed, as we helped distribute fresh water in Petit Caillou the day after the storm passed. The hurricane also provided me with my first real test as a guardian angel. During the height of the storm, we received an emergency call from a family in Bayou Boubreau, whose elderly grandfather had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack. The roads were impassable for ambulances, and helicopter evacuation was impossible due to the weather conditions. "Catherine, you're the smallest rider," Delilah said, studying the weather radar on her tablet. "You and Luna take the medical kit and see if you can get through." Riding a motorcycle through a hurricane, even a relatively mild one, was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The wind was strong enough to push my bike sideways on the road, and the rain was so heavy that I could barely see 20 feet ahead. Several times I had to stop and wait for brief lulls in the storm to navigate particularly treacherous sections of road. But we made it to Bayou Boubreau, and Luna's EMT training proved invaluable in stabilizing the elderly man until the storm passed and proper medical evacuation could be arranged. He survived, made a full recovery, and I gained a new understanding of what it meant to be part of the guardian angel's family. You did good, Delilah told me that evening as we sat in the community center, listening to the storm winds dying down outside. Real good. Most people wouldn't have attempted that ride in those conditions. I wasn't going to let someone die because I was too scared to get on my bike, I replied. That's exactly the attitude that makes a good guardian angel, she said. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite the fear when someone needs help. As our 2-week deployment drew to a close, I found myself reluctant to leave Louisiana. The bayou communities had become real to me in a way that my isolated life in Oklahoma never had. These people had faced incredible challenges and responded with resilience, generosity, and a fierce commitment to taking care of each other. On our last day, Evangeline Thibodeau organized a community dinner in Petit Caillou to thank the guardian angels for our work in the area. It was held in the community center, with tables made from sawhorses and plywood and decorated with wildflowers picked from the roadside. The food was incredible: fresh seafood prepared in traditional Cajun style, homemade bread, vegetables from gardens that had somehow survived the flooding. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere of celebration and gratitude that made the evening special. Y'all became family to us, Evangeline said during the informal ceremony. When we needed help, you came. When we needed someone to listen, you listened. When we needed someone to believe we could rebuild, you believed. One by one, community members stood up to share stories about how the guardian angels had helped their families during the recovery process. Some of the stories were about specific assistance, like medical supplies or construction materials. But many of them were about less tangible things: the comfort of knowing that someone cared, the encouragement to keep going when the task seemed impossible, the reminder that they weren't facing their challenges alone. As I listened to these testimonials, I realized that I'd learned more about community and resilience in 2 weeks than I'd learned in 57 years of living. These people had shown me what it looked like to turn suffering into strength, to transform individual pain into collective action, to respond to loss not with withdrawal but with deeper engagement. What's next for you? Claude, the fisherman whose boat we'd helped repair, asked me as the evening was winding down. It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about. Our Louisiana deployment was ending, but I wasn't ready to go back to my old life in Oklahoma. I'd gotten a taste of what it felt like to be useful, to be part of something larger than my own grief and isolation. I don't know, I said honestly, but I know I can't go back to the way things were before. The next morning, as we prepared to leave Louisiana, Delilah pulled me aside for a private conversation. You've done well, she said, better than well. You've shown the kind of commitment and adaptability that we look for in long-term guardian angels members. What does long-term mean? It means making this work a permanent part of your life instead of just a temporary experiment. It means being available for deployments year-round, developing specialized skills, taking on leadership responsibilities. The offer was both exciting and terrifying. It would mean selling my property in Oklahoma, giving up any possibility of rebuilding my old life, and committing to a future that was completely uncertain. But as I looked around at the bayou landscape one last time, watching the morning sun reflect off the still waters and feeling the warm Louisiana breeze on my face, I realized that uncertainty might be exactly what I needed. I want to do it, I said. I want to become a full-time guardian angel. Delilah smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. There's a training facility in Colorado where we teach advanced disaster response techniques. If you're serious about this, that's where you need to go next. As our convoy of motorcycles pulled away from the warehouse in Lafayette and headed north toward Arkansas, I felt the same mix of sadness and anticipation that I'd experienced when leaving Oklahoma. I was saying goodbye to a place that had changed me fundamentally, but I was also riding toward a future that promised continued growth and challenge. In my rearview mirror, I could see the Louisiana bayou disappearing behind a curtain of Spanish moss and morning mist. But I carried with me the lessons I'd learned from people like Evangeline and Claude and Father Boudreau, that resilience is a choice, that community is a practice, and that the best response to loss is not withdrawal but deeper engagement with the world and the people who share it. The woman who'd knelt on a sidewalk in Oklahoma 3 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone I was still getting to know. Someone who could ride a motorcycle through a hurricane to deliver medical supplies. Someone who could navigate family disputes and cultural differences to help communities rebuild. Someone who'd found a way to transform grief into purpose and isolation into connection. I didn't know what challenges lay ahead in Colorado or what future deployments would demand of me. But I knew that I was no longer afraid of uncertainty. I'd learned to trust myself, to trust my motorcycle, and to trust the guardian angel's family that had welcomed me into their ranks. As we crossed the state line from Louisiana into Arkansas, I felt like I was crossing into a new phase of my life. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was my road to travel, and I was no longer traveling it alone. 18 months after leaving Louisiana, I found myself back in Oklahoma, but not for the reasons I'd expected. The call had come in at 3 in the morning, while I was at the Guardian Angels training facility in Colorado. Another tornado outbreak was tearing through the same region where my journey had begun, and this time I was part of the response team heading in to help. The irony wasn't lost on me as I suited up in my Guardian Angels gear and prepared my Harley for the deployment. The last time I'd faced an Oklahoma tornado, I'd been a helpless victim kneeling on a sidewalk. Now I was riding toward the destruction as someone who might actually be able to help. The tornado that hit Millbrook Springs was an EF5, the most powerful classification on the enhanced Fujita scale. Unlike the tornado that had destroyed my farmhouse, this one had torn directly through the center of town, leveling the high school where I'd sheltered after my own disaster and destroying most of the downtown business district. Our Guardian Angels team arrived 36 hours after the tornado hit, part of a coordinated response that included teams from Texas, Arkansas, and Colorado. I was no longer the frightened novice who'd learned to ride motorcycles 18 months earlier. I'd completed advanced training in emergency medical response, disaster psychology, and logistics coordination. I'd deployed to hurricane zones in Florida, wildfire areas in California, and flood regions across the Midwest. I'd become one of the experienced team members that new volunteers looked to for guidance. But nothing had prepared me for the emotional impact of returning to the place where my new life had begun. The town was unrecognizable. The Emergency Operations Center where I'd spent my first night as a tornado refugee was gone, reduced to a pile of twisted metal and concrete blocks. The elementary school where the Guardian Angels had set up their camp was damaged beyond repair. Even the cemetery where David was buried had been hit, with centuries-old oak trees uprooted and headstones scattered across the landscape like broken teeth. "You okay?" Delilah asked as we established our base of operations in a church parking lot on the outskirts of town. She'd noticed me staring at the devastation with an expression that probably revealed more than I intended. "This is where it all started," I said simply. "This is where I met you." She nodded, understanding immediately. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things, or maybe it's giving you a chance to come full circle. Our first priority was search and rescue operations. Despite the advance warning systems and widespread media coverage, the tornado had caught some people unprepared. Several families were still unaccounted for, and time was critical for finding survivors trapped in collapsed buildings. I was assigned to work with a team led by Marcus Williams, a search and rescue specialist from the Colorado Guardian Angels chapter. Marcus was about 10 years younger than me, with the kind of calm intensity that comes from years of military training. He'd served 3 tours as a combat medic in Afghanistan before joining the Guardian Angels, and he had an uncanny ability to organize complex rescue operations under chaotic conditions. "We're going to be working primarily in the residential areas north of downtown," Marcus explained as our team gathered around a map of the affected area. "Most of the commercial district is too dangerous for ground operations right now, but the fire department thinks there might be survivors in some of the houses that were only partially collapsed." The search work was methodical and emotionally draining. Each house we entered could contain either miraculous survivors or heartbreaking losses. We used listening devices to detect sounds from beneath rubble, trained dogs to locate human scents, and carefully coordinated with structural engineers to ensure that our rescue efforts didn't cause further building collapses. On our second day, we found them. An elderly couple named Robert and Helen Morrison had been trapped in their basement for almost 60 hours when their house collapsed around them. They were dehydrated and frightened, but alive. Helen had a broken arm, and Robert was showing signs of shock, but both were conscious and responsive when we pulled them from the wreckage. "Thank you," Helen whispered as I helped load her into the ambulance. "We thought nobody was coming for us." "We always come," I told her, echoing words I'd heard Delilah say dozens of times during my training. "We never leave anyone behind." That evening, as our team debriefed at the end of another 18-hour day, I found myself thinking about the parallels between the Morrisons' situation and my own experience 18 months earlier. They'd been trapped in the ruins of their old life, unable to escape on their own, waiting for someone to show them that there was still hope for rescue and recovery. "Penny for your thoughts," Marcus said, settling into the folding chair next to mine with a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the Mesozoic era. "Just thinking about how people survive disasters," I said, "not just physically but emotionally. How they rebuild their lives when everything they've known gets destroyed." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's different for everyone. Some people are incredibly resilient. They lose everything and bounce back stronger than before. Others get stuck in the trauma and never really recover. What makes the difference? Community, mostly. Having people who care about you and are willing to help you rebuild. That's why this work matters so much. We're not just delivering supplies or pulling people out of collapsed buildings. We're showing them that they're not alone." The conversation was interrupted by Delilah's voice crackling over our radios. "All teams, we've got a situation developing at the temporary shelter. Need experienced personnel to respond immediately." The temporary shelter had been set up in the gymnasium of a school that had escaped the tornado's direct path. It was housing about 200 displaced residents, including dozens of families with young children. But the stress of the disaster and the crowded conditions were beginning to create tensions that threatened to boil over into something dangerous. The immediate crisis involved a dispute between two groups of families over access to limited resources, but the underlying issues were more complex. Some of the shelter residents were people who'd lost everything and had nowhere else to go. Others were staying temporarily while insurance adjusters assessed damage to their homes. The two groups had different needs and different expectations, and those differences were creating friction. "This is classic disaster psychology," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who joined our team specifically to help with community mental health issues. "People who've experienced trauma often have a reduced capacity for tolerance and patience. Small problems become big problems very quickly." Marcus and I were assigned to help mediate the resource allocation dispute, while Dr. Martinez worked with families who were showing signs of severe psychological distress. It was delicate work that required balancing immediate practical needs with longer-term community stability. The solution we developed wasn't perfect, but it was workable. We established separate areas within the shelter for different types of families, created more structured systems for distributing supplies, and arranged for additional counseling resources to help people process their trauma in healthy ways. But the incident reminded me how complex disaster recovery really was. The physical damage from tornadoes and hurricanes was dramatic and visible, but the psychological and social damage often lasted much longer and was much harder to address. On our fourth day in Millbrook Springs, I made a personal pilgrimage to the empty lot where my farmhouse had once stood. The property had been sold to a developer who planned to build a subdivision of modern homes, but construction hadn't started yet. The tornado had missed this area entirely, leaving the landscape exactly as I'd last seen it 18 months earlier. Standing on that familiar concrete foundation, I tried to imagine what my life would have been like if I'd chosen to rebuild instead of joining the guardian angels. I probably would have recreated something very similar to my old existence. Comfortable, safe, predictable, and ultimately empty. Instead, I'd spent the last 18 months riding motorcycles across the country, learning skills I'd never imagined needing, helping communities recover from disasters, and discovering strengths I'd never known I possessed. It hadn't been an easy life, but it had been a meaningful one. "Figured I might find you here," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Tommy approaching, the big man with the beard, who'd been part of the original group that sheltered in my storm cellar. He'd driven down from Kansas specifically to participate in the Millbrook Springs response. "Hey Tommy. Good to see you again." "You too, Kat." Tommy was one of the few people who still called me by my old nickname. Most of the guardian angels knew me as Catherine, the competent disaster response specialist. But Tommy remembered the frightened woman who'd opened her cellar door to save a group of strangers. "Been thinking about that night we spent in your cellar," he said, settling his considerable bulk onto a chunk of concrete that had once been part of my front steps. "Crazy how much has changed since then." "You mean how much I've changed?" "Not just you, all of us really. That tornado brought us together in a way that changed the whole organization. We started paying more attention to the human side of disaster response, not just the logistics and supply delivery." I hadn't realized that my experience had influenced the guardian angels' approach to their work, but as Tommy explained it, I could see how that first deployment in Louisiana had been different from previous operations. There'd been more emphasis on building relationships with local communities, more attention to the psychological aspects of recovery, more recognition that effective disaster relief required understanding the complex social dynamics of the places they were trying to help. "You taught us something important," Tommy continued. "That the best way to help disaster victims is to become part of their community, not just to drop off supplies and move on to the next crisis." That evening, Delilah announced that our official deployment in Millbrook Springs was nearly complete. The search and rescue phase was over, the immediate emergency needs had been addressed, and longer-term recovery efforts were being handed over to FEMA and local organizations. But she also had an announcement that surprised everyone. "The town council has asked the guardian angels to consider establishing a permanent presence in this region," she said during our evening briefing. "They want us to help them develop better disaster preparedness and response capabilities for future emergencies." The proposal would involve setting up a training facility, similar to Rick's operation in Tulsa, but focused specifically on tornado response and recovery. It would provide ongoing education for local emergency responders, maintain stockpiles of emergency supplies, and serve as a coordination center for future disaster responses in the region. "We need someone to run the operation," Delilah continued, looking directly at me. "Someone with local knowledge, someone who understands both the guardian angel's mission and the specific needs of this community. Someone who's proven they can handle complex challenges under pressure." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. It would mean settling down again, after 18 months of constant travel, but in a completely different way than my old life. Instead of retreating into isolation, I'd be building something new that could help thousands of people prepare for and recover from disasters. "I need to think about it," I said, though I suspected my decision was already made. The next morning, I rode my Harley through the neighborhoods of Millbrook Springs, assessing the damage and watching the early stages of recovery efforts. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of the same resilience and determination I'd witnessed in the Louisiana bayou communities. Neighbors helping neighbors clear debris, families camping in tents while they waited for insurance settlements, children playing in yards where houses had stood just days earlier. These people weren't victims waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They were survivors who needed temporary support while they rebuilt their lives. The Guardian Angels facility could provide that support while also preparing them to be more resilient when the next disaster struck. Because there would be a next disaster. In Tornado Alley, that was as certain as sunrise. That afternoon, I called Delilah and accepted the position. Within a week, I'd signed the paperwork to establish the Guardian Angels Midwest Training Center on 20 acres of land just outside Millbrook Springs. The property included a house that would serve as my residence and several outbuildings that could be converted into classrooms and equipment storage areas. 6 months later, the facility was operational. We offered weekend training courses for local emergency responders, maintained a fleet of motorcycles for rapid response to isolated areas, and hosted regular community meetings where residents could learn about disaster preparedness and recovery resources. But the most meaningful part of the operation was the relationships I'd built with local residents. People like Evangeline Thibodeau had taught me that effective disaster relief wasn't about swooping in as an outsider to save the day. It was about becoming part of the community, understanding local needs and resources, and empowering residents to take care of each other. The work wasn't always dramatic. Most days involved mundane tasks, like equipment maintenance, paperwork, and meetings with government officials. But every few months, severe weather would threaten the region, and the training and preparation would pay off in lives saved and communities that recovered more quickly because they were better prepared. And sometimes, in the middle of a crisis, I'd encounter someone who reminded me of the woman I'd been 2 years earlier. Someone who'd lost everything and didn't know how to move forward. Someone who needed to be shown that disaster wasn't the end of their story, but a chance to write a new chapter. Last week, a young woman named Jessica arrived at our facility 3 days after losing her home in a straight-line windstorm. She was 28 years old, recently divorced, and convinced that her life was over because the insurance settlement wouldn't cover the cost of rebuilding. "I don't know what to do," she said, sitting in my office with tears streaming down her face. "I put everything I had into that house. Now it's gone, and I'm starting over with nothing." I listened to her story, hearing echoes of my own experience in her words. Then I told her about the guardian angels, about the training programs we offered, about the opportunities to turn her pain into purpose by helping other people facing similar challenges. "You think I could learn to ride a motorcycle?" she asked skeptically. "I learned at 57, I told her. "If I can do it, anyone can do it." 2 months later, Jessica completed her basic motorcycle training and joined her first disaster response deployment to help communities affected by flooding in eastern Oklahoma. She was nervous, inexperienced, and convinced she had nothing valuable to contribute. She was also exactly where she needed to be. As I watched her load supplies onto her motorcycle and join the convoy heading toward the flood zone, I thought about the tornado that had destroyed my farmhouse and changed my life forever. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything I'd built and everything I'd hoped for. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything I'd never dared to dream. The woman who'd knelt on that sidewalk 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, but thoroughly appreciated. Someone who could face any storm, because she'd learned that destruction was just another word for opportunity, that loss was just the universe, making room for something better, and that the best response to having your life torn apart was to help other people rebuild theirs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.